There Will Be Wolves by Karleen Bradford, Chapter 9. What has happened? Ursula reached for the child. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, and then accepted Ursula's help. Together they carefully laid Verity down on the ground, and Ursula felt for the pulse of life that should be throbbing in the child's neck. For an instant she couldn't find it, and her heart sank. Then her probing fingers felt a flutter. It was weak, but steady. Ursula, what's wrong? Bruno had been awakened by the commotion and was standing over them. Ursula immediately signaled him to silence. Elizabeth had startled at the sight of him and looked as if she was ready to flee. It's all right, Ursula reassured her. To Bruno she said quietly, Bring me father's herb bag out of the wagon. The child is hurt. As she worked over her, Verity's eyes opened. She looked up at Ursula, and they widened with fright. Elizabeth whispered to her quickly in a language Ursula couldn't understand. Verity clasped her mother's hand tightly, watching Ursula fearfully, but she lay still. I'll have to make a poultice, Ursula said. Bruno, will you put a kettle of water on the fire to boil? She turned to Elizabeth. She has a bad bruise on one side of her head. How did it happen? She fell. Elizabeth's voice was defensive. She kept her eyes on the child and would not look at Ursula. Ursula decided not to argue the matter at the moment. She busied herself making the poultice and applying it to the child's head. When she finished, she looked over at Elizabeth. Stay here with me tonight. I must keep watch over her to make certain she does not sleep too deeply. It's dangerous. After a blow to the head, such as she has suffered. I cannot. Elizabeth looked desperate. Lemmet sleeps now. He doesn't know I'm here. I must be back by the time he awakens. Go, then, but leave Verity here with me. But, Elizabeth began again. She must not be moved any more than necessary, Ursula said. And she certainly must not be taken back within reach of that man. For a moment the two young women almost glared at each other. Then Elizabeth's eyes dropped again. What shall I say? She asked weakly. Ursula's patience gave out. Tell him she's ill, she snapped. Tell him anything you want, but leave that child here with me. Elizabeth looked as if she would argue further, but Ursula stared her down. Ursula might be the younger of the two, but it was clear she was the stronger. Elizabeth gave in. She bent toward her daughter and murmured a few soft words. The child immediately began to cry and clung to her. Elizabeth spoke to her again, gently disengaging her hands. When she rose, Verity made as if to go after her, but Ursula held her back. Just then Samson, alerted by the noise outside the tent, came to investigate. He ambled over to the child on the ground, sniffed curiously, and licked her cheek. The child stopped in mid-cry and looked at him in astonishment. Then she looked up at Ursula. In spite of herself, the wonderment in Verity's eyes made Ursula smile. He's just a dog, child, she said gently. Give him a pat, that's what he wants. She took Verity's hand in her own and passed it over the dog's scruffy head. Verity flinched, but then, hesitantly, began to pat the dog on her own. Samson wagged his tail delightedly. Very slowly, a smile began at the corners of the child's mouth as well. Elizabeth watched, then melted silently into the shadows. The next morning Ursula was awakened from a light doze by the touch of sunlight on her face and the sound of birds singing. She had made a bed for herself and Verity the night before in a wagon, so as to not disturb her father. She looked quickly down at the child beside her. Although Verity had been restless for most of the night, she seemed to be sleeping peacefully now. Ursula had sung to her and talked to her, and Verity, at first fearful, had gradually succumbed. She slept now with one thumb in her mouth, and the other hand wrapped tightly around a fold of Ursula's cloak. Bruno was already up and gone off somewhere, Ursula noticed, probably to see to their horse. What is the meaning of this? A voice, guttural and harsh, jolted Ursula into complete awareness. She sat up abruptly, waking Verity as she did so. The child took one look at the man standing beside the wagon, uttered a cry, and then buried closer to Ursula. "Give me that child!" Behind Lemmet, Ursula could see Elizabeth, standing, twisting her hands together, helplessly. Ursula was filled with fury. "I'll do no such thing," she answered. "The child has been hurt. She'll stay with me." Lemmet took a menacing step toward them. At that moment Bruno reappeared. He stepped between the man and the wagon. "I think you'd best let them be," he said quietly. "And who are you to tell me what to do?" Lemmet answered. His voice rose to a shout, and he raised his fist threateningly. Bruno stood his ground, hands at his side. "The girl has been badly hurt. The girl who tends her is a healer. She tends Count Emile himself. Perhaps we should take this matter to him." Lemmet, in the act of moving toward Bruno, stopped. Count Emile had an evil reputation among the Crusaders. He had had one of his own servants flogged almost to the point of death for spilling a horn of ale on him. "The child belongs to me," he blustered. "She does not," Ursula broke in hotly. "The child is ill," Bruno said quickly. "She cannot walk. If you take her from us, you will have to carry her. If you leave her here, we can care for her and let her ride in our wagon. When she is recovered, we can speak again about what should be done with her." "When she's recovered, she will return to me. When she's recovered, Ursula began. Bruno silenced her with a warning look. Behind Lemmet, Elizabeth still hovered nervously. Ursula sent her a withering glance. Then she turned her attention back to Lemmet. "I need that girl," he said. "She performs a useful service for me. Folk give more freely to a child." "She won't perform if she dies," Ursula countered. "She's not hurt that badly." "She is. And if you take her from me, that will surely happen." Ursula saw Elizabeth gasp and turn pale. She looked away from her scornfully. Ursula was exaggerating, of course, but she felt no need to let Elizabeth know that. She had let this monster get his hands on her daughter, let her suffer the consequences of it. Lemmet made up his mind. "Keep her, then. But just until she's well enough to get back to work. I don't tolerate useless people around me." He whirled on Elizabeth. "What are you doing here?" he roared. "Get back and see to our breakfast." With a last despairing look at her daughter, Elizabeth turned and left. Ursula turned to Bruno. "Thank you," she began. "You were very hard on that poor woman," Bruno said, cutting her off. "Have you no feeling for how she suffers?" Ursula's back was up again immediately. "I feel for how her child suffers, and it is her fault." She clutched Verity to her as Bruno began to gather wood for their morning fire. "How can this be?" Ursula thought, watching him. "We were such good friends in Cologne, but now it would seem that all we can do is argue." Ursula kept Verity close to her and made her stay in the wagon, even after she was well enough to walk. She was afraid that if Lemmet saw her up and around, he would come for her. The child still wept for her mother, but was beginning to trust Ursula and doted on Samson, who returned the affection. The next time Ursula saw Elizabeth was one evening a few days later, when the minstrels were singing again around their campfire. Elizabeth caught sight of Ursula standing in the half-darkness listening to them. Her voice broke in mid-song, then she recovered herself. She glanced quickly at Lemmet to see if he had noticed. Ursula backed into the shadows, not wanting him to see her. When the minstrels had finished and Elizabeth was collecting coins in her sack, she made her way cautiously over to the bushes where Ursula stood. "My daughter?" she asked breathlessly, looking over her shoulder to make certain that Lemmet was not observing her. "How does she?" "She is well," Ursula replied. She would have turned away, but the remembrance of Bruno's words stayed her. "Really, she is well," she said more kindly. "We're taking good care of her." "Thank you, oh, thank you," Elizabeth said. "I can never repay you for your help. But when she is well enough, she must come back. You must bring her back to me. Lemmet insists." Ursula stared at her unbelievingly. "You would take her back to be beaten again?" she asked. She could see a new bruise on Elizabeth's arm. "If we're careful, if we do as he says and don't make him angry," Elizabeth stuttered. "He's a good man, really. He just can't help himself if we make him angry." Ursula made a sound of utter disgust and turned her back on the woman. "What would you have me do?" she heard Elizabeth wail from behind her. "Who else would take care of us? Who else would provide for us?" They reached Hungary hard on the heels of Walter Sansavor's men. The city walls came in sight, and on them, displayed for all to see, were the arms and what was left of the clothing of the 16 men who had robbed the bazaar. The gates of the city were firmly closed against them. No one came out to greet them. That night, as Ursula entered Count Emil's tent, she was surprised to hear voices. Usually at this time he was alone. She was even more astounded to realize that the other man there was Peter the Hermit. The holy man of Amiens was standing at the back of the tent, facing the Count. His eyes were blazing. "They must supply us," he shouted, as she hesitated in the doorway. "They must give us whatever we need. We are God's holy army. We're on the most holy of all pilgrimages, on the Pope's own crusade." In the more than 2 months that had passed since he had first entered Cologne, he had learned enough of their dialect to speak it without an interpreter, but his words were so wild and incoherent that it was almost impossible to understand him. Ursula backed out hastily. She waited until she saw him leave before she approached the tent again. When she entered this time, the Count had thrown himself down on the velvet-covered straw pallet that served as his bed. "Give me my medicine and leave," he snarled at her savagely. Ursula complied and left as quickly as possible. At their campsite she found Bruno sitting with his back against the wagon where Verity slept. Forgetting the uneasiness that had been between them lately, Ursula hurried to tell him what she had overheard. "I'm afraid, Bruno," she whispered. "The hermit looked insane with fury, and the Count! I've never seen him in so foul a mood. Something terrible is going to happen, I'm certain of it." "There are mutterings in the camp as well," Bruno answered. "People are hungry and angered that the townsfolk will not aid them." Ursula climbed into the wagon, curled up beside Verity, and clasped the child to her tightly. Her heart pounded in her chest. From the tent she could hear her father coughing incessantly. Bruno stirred restlessly by the fire. The next morning, on her way to the river bank to wash out their breakfast pot, Ursula pushed through some bushes only to stumble upon 2 men. One was a soldier, the red cross crudely stitched onto the shoulder of his uniform. The other was obviously a villager. The villager was holding a pair of old leather shoes, worn and ripped out at the toe. "That's robbery!" the soldier cried. "Take it or leave it," the villager answered. "You'll not do any better, not around here. We don't want the likes of you rabble here, and the sooner you clear out, the better." "But you promised me new shoes. For the price I paid, I should have good, sound shoes. These are trash. I want back the payment I gave you." The villager laughed and threw the shoes into the dust at the soldier's feet. "Then you'll have to come and get it," he said mockingly. He turned on his heel and headed back to the village. Within moments a crowd gathered around the soldier. Resentful mutterings soon gave way to curses, and those in turn gave way to shouts. Before Ursula could realize what was happening, the number of soldiers had swelled alarmingly, and more were pouring in. Soon it seemed as if the whole camp was on the move. "Justice!" she heard one cry. "Revenge!" cried another. "We'll teach them to cheat soldiers of God." Then, before her horrified eyes, what seemed like the whole army of soldiers that accompanied them took to horse and galloped in a furious storm towards the city. She ran back to their campsite. "Bruno!" she gasped as she saw him watering the horse. "The soldiers have gone mad and they're storming the city." Bruno reacted at once. "If that's so, there'll be fighting. Quickly, we must strike the tent and pack everything up. If the fighting reaches here, we must be ready to move at once." Verity began to cry. Ursula scooped her up and lifted her onto the wagon into her nest of rugs. She collared Samson and dumped him in beside her. "Don't cry," she said, using every effort of will she possessed to make her voice calm. The child couldn't understand the words, but she could understand a frightened tone of voice only too well. Ursula patted her for a moment, then made signs to stop her that she was to hold Samson. The tears stopped. Thumb in mouth, Verity clutched the dog and huddled into the blankets. Ursula looked at Bruno. "Elizabeth?" she asked. "Where could she be? Should we look for her?" "There might not be time. We must not get separated. God willing, she will come to us before anything starts. If not—" His words trailed off. Master William had heard and was already out of the tent and starting to carry things to the wagon. "Master," Bruno said, "please sit and rest. Ursula and I can do all that's necessary." But the old man seemed not to hear him. He stopped and gave Bruno a confused look. "Fighting?" he asked. "There ought not to be fighting." Then he doubled over with a paroxysm of coughing. Ursula looked despairingly at Bruno as she reached for her father's arm. "Father," she said gently, "please do as Bruno says. We'll load the wagon, but you must save your strength." Her father looked back at her. "What is happening, child?" His voice wavered. "This is not the way it was supposed to be." At noon they were still waiting. Elizabeth had not appeared. Others in camp had also taken fright and were hastening to pack up their belongings. No one seemed to know what was going on. Once Ursula saw Count Emile come out of his tent and confer briefly with the hermit. They turned worried glances toward the city, and then went back into Peter's tent and did not come out again. The majority of the soldiers had been in the mob that stormed the city, and many of the ordinary men, inflamed by the riot, had run after them, brandishing cudgels and any other weapon they could get their hands on. As a result, the camp had a strangely deserted, expectant air. It was early afternoon when a shout was finally raised from the road leading to Semlin. Almost immediately, the thunder of horses' hooves was heard, and the cloud of dust billowed into the air. The soldiers charged back into sight. Many were bloody and bore the marks of a furious battle. Some swayed in their saddles alarmingly, but every one of them was cheering. They rode into the center of camp and began throwing sacks on the ground. "Grain," they shouted, "and turnips, meat, clothing, supplies for all. No one can stand before us. Now they know what happens to those who will not give to us freely." Peter the hermit came out of his tent, closely followed by Count Emile. The hermit held up his hands in an effort to bring quiet and order. The gesture was useless. With a roar, the people surged forward. Sacks were ripped open, grain spilled on the ground. Men and women fought and clawed to get as much of the foodstuffs and clothing for themselves as they possibly could. Cloaks were torn, bread trampled into the dust. Fights broke out all over. A man grabbed a sack of something, he probably had no idea what, and began to run with it toward Ursula and Bruno. Another tripped him and grabbed for the bag. As Ursula watched, paralyzed with shock, the first drew out a dagger and plunged it up to the hilt in the second man's back. A soldier, still hot and inflamed with battle lust, rode by and saw him do it. Drawing his already blood-stained sword, he lunged and cut the assailant down. Then he rode off, howling his battle cry. Ursula stared at the sack on the ground in front of them. Blood from both men was slowly seeping into it. She turned away and vomited. Bruno was at her side in an instant. He held her while she tried to pull herself together. From somewhere he produced a scrap of cloth and gave it to her. She wiped her mouth with it and spat out the last bitter taste of bile. "There will be retaliation," he said to her then. "We must get back to the wagon." The camp was now in utter confusion. The hermit and the rest of the noblemen were still vainly trying to call for order, but it wasn't until the last of the booty had either been snatched up or trampled into uselessness that the general insanity subsided. Then the word was passed quickly. 4,000 Hungarians have been killed. They are massing for revenge. Move out, move out. This time Ursula and Bruno were among the first of the wagons to leave. The nobles and the soldiers had formed up hurriedly, and the long train began to move, even as men were still straggling back along the road from the city. Many of them carried sacks and stolen clothing, but no one now thought to fight for it. The enormity of what had occurred was just beginning to be understood. 4,000 killed. Ursula's mind was blank with horror.